On a highway outside Redstone, Texas, Officer Marcus Hale watched his partner unzip a backpack full of cocaine and hand it back to the driver. No arrest, no radio call, no report filed. Just, drive safe tonight. And then silence, and the taillights of a sedan disappearing into the dark, and Marcus standing on the shoulder of Highway 90, understanding something that would take him months to fully comprehend. This wasn't a corrupt cop taking a bribe. This was something organized. Something that had been running for a long time. Something that everyone around him already knew about and nobody had told him. But to understand how Marcus ended up on that highway, you have to go back 3 months. To a woman named Carol Briggs, a spreadsheet that didn't add up, and a decision that would pull Marcus into the most dangerous investigation of his life. One he didn't fully understand until it was already over. Carol Briggs had been a state investigator for 20 years, and the thing that had kept her employed that long was a specific sensitivity to absence. Not to what was there, to what wasn't. She could look at a data set and feel the shape of missing data the way a dentist can feel a cavity before the X-ray confirms it. She'd been watching Redstone's numbers for 14 months. Redstone, Texas sat 40 miles from the Mexican border on a highway corridor that federal analysts considered one of the 3 busiest narcotics transit routes in the country. DEA estimates put the volume of product moving through it somewhere between 8 and 12 tons per year. Cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, trucks with false floors, sedans with modified gas tanks. The corridor was relentless. Redstone's arrest log for the last quarter showed 6 traffic citations. 2 were for expired registration. Briggs pulled more reports. She cross-referenced patrol hours against incident filings. She requested the evidence log and found it so thin it was almost transparent. She sat with all of it for 3 days and then called Marcus Hale, because Marcus Hale had a reputation for something very specific and very dangerous in law enforcement. He didn't look away. 5 years earlier, Marcus had been assigned to a department in Ector County and had noticed things that his colleagues appeared not to notice. A sergeant who knew about busts before the warrant was filed. Evidence that arrived at the lab lighter than it left the scene. He had documented it quietly, reported it carefully, and sat through 18 months of internal review, while 2 officers threatened his career, and one of them cornered him in a parking garage at 11 at night, and said something that wasn't quite explicit enough to report but moved Marcus's hand to his holster. 2 officers went to prison. A captain lost his career, and Marcus had been transferred and reassigned and briefly celebrated and then mostly left alone. When Briggs described what Redstone's data suggested, Marcus didn't spend the first 10 minutes explaining why it was probably nothing. He said, "How long do you think it's been running?" She said she didn't know. He said, "Then we should find out." He drove into Redstone on a Tuesday morning in late October. Flat sky, dry brush on both sides of the highway. A town that looked from the road like 100 other small Texas towns. Main Street with a hardware store, a diner, 2 churches, a gas station that also sold bait. Chief Frank Dalton was a big man in his 60s with a white mustache and the comfortable authority of someone who'd been the most powerful person in a small place for a very long time. He welcomed Marcus with coffee and 40 minutes of genuine-seeming warmth. The school had a good football team. Patty's made the best chicken fried steak in the county. Then, looking out at the quiet street, Dalton said, "You'll find it's pretty quiet around here." Marcus said that was fine. He said he appreciated the change of pace. He drove home and wrote in his legal pad, 25 years. Would have been here when the route was established. Would have had to have been. He circled the last line. The first 3 weeks were normal in a way that made Marcus feel like he was being watched performing normalcy. He rode patrols. He listened to a young deputy named Torres talk about his girlfriend in a barbecue place 2 towns over. He ate at Patty's and learned the waitress's name. He became, as far as anyone could observe, a new officer settling in without difficulty. And he watched. He watched the trucks on Highway 90. He noted the plates, the times, the patterns. He noticed that certain vehicles passed through the corridor during the same 2-hour window every Thursday night. He noticed that during that window, patrol routes shifted, almost imperceptibly, almost naturally, away from the highway. Not obviously. Not in any way that would appear in a log, just a slow drift, a preference for quieter side streets, a tendency to end up parked at the diner for a longer break than usual. Torres was usually the one driving during those shifts. Marcus watched Torres. He watched the easy way Torres talked, the jokes, the casual complaints about the schedule. He watched Torres redirect a dispatch call one evening, slowly, asking unnecessary follow-up questions for 40 minutes, while a truck with Oklahoma plates sat motionless on the access road before eventually continuing west. Marcus watched and said nothing and wondered if Torres understood what he was doing, or if he was just a piece that moved when the board required it. He didn't know. That uncertainty sat in his chest like something unresolved. Then came the night on Highway 90 and the backpack. Officer Pruitt had 11 years on the Redstone force. He talked less than Torres, and drove with the economy of someone who had long since stopped needing to perform competence. He pulled the silver sedan over for a routine check. The two men inside had the specific stillness of people who had been trained to appear calm when they weren't. Pruitt asked to search the vehicle. The driver nodded. The black backpack was on the rear seat. Pruitt unzipped it. 4 brick-shaped packages tightly wrapped in dark plastic, electrical taped at the seams. Marcus had seen that configuration in training and in the field. He knew exactly what it was. Pruitt looked at the packages for a long, quiet moment. Then he zipped the bag closed, handed it back through the window, said, "Drive safe tonight." Marcus stood on the shoulder of the highway and said nothing, and watched the taillights disappear, and felt the shape of something much larger than 14 officers in a small town. They drove 6 miles in complete silence. Marcus stared at the road ahead. He could feel Pruitt not looking at him. That specific, careful not looking of a man waiting to see what you'll do. Marcus did nothing. The envelope was under his windshield wiper when he got back to the station. Plain white. No name, no address. 1 sheet of paper inside, 4 words printed in the center of the page with the precision of someone who had spent time on the phrasing, "Stop asking questions." He looked around the parking lot. A light on in Dalton's office, though the chief's truck was gone. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket and thought about what the note actually meant. Not what it said, what it meant. He had not been asking questions. Not visibly. Not in any way that should have registered. Which meant someone was watching him more closely than he'd understood. He went home and put the note in a folder inside a hollowed-out textbook and lay on his back in the dark, thinking about where he'd been careless. He became more careful. He stopped lingering at the records terminal. He stopped any behavior that could be read as investigative and became visibly a man who had settled in. Poker with Torres twice. Patties for lunch 3 times a week. He tipped well. He laughed at department jokes. And then, one evening when Dalton was off-site and 2 junior officers were on patrol, he accessed the records terminal with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood he might not get a second chance. He worked through 3 years of logs. He wasn't looking for obvious forgery. He was looking for the shape of cleaned data. He found it. Not in what was there, but in what wasn't. Incidents that should have generated follow-up reports and hadn't. Evidence checkouts with no corresponding case files. Patrol logs showing a unit on Route 90 for 2-hour windows with 0 traffic stops across dozens of shifts. Not 1 stop. On a major narcotics corridor. For 3 years. He started photographing the screen. He was on the 4th page of evidence logs when a door opened somewhere behind him. He closed the window. He turned around slowly. His heart was going. It was Torres, holding a coffee cup, looking mildly surprised to see Marcus at the terminal. "Catching up on paperwork?" Torres said. "Just reviewing some old incident reports," Marcus said. "Trying to learn the area." Torres nodded and kept walking toward the break room. He didn't look back. Marcus sat completely still until he heard the coffee machine run. Then he finished what he was doing and closed the terminal and walked to the bathroom and stood at the sink for a moment looking at himself in the mirror. Torres had looked at him for 1 second too long. Just 1 second, maybe nothing, maybe everything, maybe. The last Friday of the month, a bar called Donahue's out on the county road. Cold beer, a pool table, the particular looseness of people who spend their days inside hierarchy. Marcus went because not going would have been more conspicuous than going. A deputy named Cordero was there, 25, the newest officer besides Marcus, matching everyone drink for drink with no visible ceiling. Around 11, he settled onto the stool next to Marcus with the slackness of someone who had stopped caring about what he said. He looked at Marcus with the evaluating squint of a drunk person attempting gravity. He said, "You think we're cops, don't you?" Marcus said, "Last time I checked, that's what it says on the badge." Cordero found this funny. He laughed. Then his face went flat and he leaned slightly forward and said 5 words in a voice just above a whisper, "We're traffic control." Marcus kept his face arranged. He said, "What do you mean?" Cordero picked up his beer. He said, "We make sure the shipments move safely." He said it with the flat pride of someone describing a job done well. No shame, no nervous edge. The matter-of-factness of a man who had made his peace with what he was. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, "Huh." Cordero ordered another beer. He started talking about the pool table. He began watching Dalton specifically in December. Dalton was cautious. He made calls from his truck instead of the office. He used 2 vehicles, his department truck and a personal F-250 parked at his house. He paid cash. But patterns exist in careful people the same as anyone. They just take longer to find. Marcus followed Dalton one night when the chief left the station at 10:15 heading north on a county road. He followed with his lights off for a half-mile, then flicked them back on and stayed far enough back to be anonymous. Dalton pulled into the lot of an abandoned gas station, pumps still standing, canopy partially collapsed, and parked. 11 minutes later, a black SUV arrived from the north. No plates. 2 men got out. Marcus was flat on dry ground behind a stand of mesquite 50 meters away, camera with a long lens he'd been carrying in his patrol bag for 6 weeks. He photographed Dalton's face in profile. The 2 men, the SUV, Dalton walking a metal briefcase from the SUV to his truck. He lay in the brush for 20 minutes after both vehicles left, not moving. For the first time, he had real evidence. The chief of police, the men with no plates, the briefcase changing hands. He drove home and uploaded everything to an encrypted drive. He sent it to Briggs on Thursday. Photos, recordings, deleted records, Cordero's statement. Everything packaged carefully through the secure channel she'd established. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, her response arrived. "The investigation is being closed. No further action at this time. Do not contact this office." Marcus read it 3 times. He went outside and stood in the cold and looked at the brush stretching away behind his fence toward nothing, and felt the specific fear of understanding that the floor you thought was solid is not. He had sent documented proof of an organized corruption operation inside an entire police department. The response was a closed door and 5 words. There was only one explanation. The corruption didn't stop in Redstone. Whatever was protecting this department had reach into the state investigation office. And if it could shut down a state investigation, then Redstone wasn't the top of anything. It was a node. The call came through dispatch on a Tuesday evening. Abandoned vehicle on a county road. Marcus was listed as nearest unit. He drove out without thinking too hard about it. The road was empty. No abandoned vehicle. Flat brush on both sides, light fading fast. The 2 pickups came from behind him about 90 seconds after he stopped. They parked crosswise. 4 men got out, none of them in uniform. They moved toward him with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who don't need to hurry, because the outcome is already decided. Marcus stepped out of his cruiser. He kept his hands visible. His right hand moved slightly toward the holster and stopped there. The 4 men stopped 15 feet away. The one in the canvas jacket looked at Marcus with something close to amusement. He said, "You should mind your own business, officer." Not a threat. A statement, delivered at conversational volume by a man who expected it to land. They got back in the trucks and left. Marcus stood on the empty road after they were gone and understood what had just happened. They hadn't come to hurt him. They'd come to demonstrate that hurting him was available as an option, a menu item being shown to a customer who hadn't ordered yet. He drove back to town with both hands on the wheel. Dalton asked him to stay late on a Tuesday night. The station emptied out gradually. Torres at 6, Pruitt at 8, the desk officer at 9. By 10:15, it was just the two of them, and the low static of the scanner and the fluorescent lights doing their faint, persistent hum. Dalton came out of his office carrying a manila folder. He set it on the desk between them. He said, "Go ahead." Marcus opened it. The photographs inside were of him. Marcus entering the station, shot from a camera on a neighboring structure that Marcus had never identified. Marcus lying flat in the brush outside the abandoned gas station, with his long lens pointed at Dalton, taken from behind him, which meant there'd been a third vehicle at that meeting positioned somewhere in the dark, watching the watcher, Marcus at the records terminal. That one landed like a fist because it was time-stamped. He was at the terminal on the same night Torres had walked in for coffee, and the angle of the photo showed a small camera mounted above the emergency exit, barely visible. The kind of thing you'd only see if you were looking for it. He hadn't been looking for it. 14 photographs total. They constituted a more complete record of his investigation than anything he'd assembled about Dalton. Marcus closed the folder. Dalton leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who has arrived at the comfortable part of a conversation. He said, "You came here to investigate us." Marcus said nothing. Dalton said, "We've known that since the day you arrived." The room went very quiet. Dalton folded his hands on the desk and let that sit for a moment. Then he said it. "Someone in the state office told us you were coming." Marcus held absolutely still. Dalton continued. They had known Marcus's name, his history, his assignment. They had known the investigation was coming from Carol Briggs specifically. They had let him come. They had watched him investigate. They had let him photograph Dalton at the gas station. They had let him send everything to Briggs, because they needed something. They needed to know who had authorized the investigation, how high it went, whether there was someone above Briggs who was watching Redstone and why. They needed to know if there was a threat they hadn't yet identified. And Marcus filing his careful reports through his secure channel, photographing his evidence, communicating with Briggs. Marcus had been the data stream that answered those questions. He hadn't been investigating them. He had been delivering their intelligence for them. Dalton said, "You leave Redstone." Not a threat. A logistical statement. The meeting was over. The next item was Marcus's departure. He said, "And you should think carefully about what you know and what you're able to prove."
Marcus drove out of Redstone at midnight with everything he owned in his car and a single encrypted drive in his jacket pocket. The highway was empty. The brush country was dark. He had uncovered corruption in an entire police department. He had documented it. He had watched his partner return a backpack full of cocaine to a man on a dark highway. He had photographed the chief of police meeting traffickers at an abandoned gas station at 10:30 at night.
He had heard a deputy explain over beer that the entire department existed to escort drug shipments through a federal corridor. All of it was real. All of it was documented. And none of it had mattered in the way he'd believed it would, because none of it was the thing. Redstone was one piece, a node in something with reach far above a small-town police department, something that could shut down a state investigation with a 5-word email on a Saturday afternoon, something that had known he was coming before he arrived and had let him stay, because his investigation was more useful to them than his absence. He drove north and thought about the 14 photographs of himself. Nobody had asked him to hand over his personal encrypted drive. That had been a mistake on their part, the overconfidence of a system that had run smoothly for a long time. They'd been so focused on identifying the threat above Briggs that they hadn't accounted for what Marcus was still carrying in his pocket. He thought about Cordero at the bar, and the recording still sitting on a personal device nobody had taken. He thought about the photos of Dalton and the two men without plates. Dark, but clear, time-stamped, geolocated. They had used him to find a leak, but they had shown him the system to do it. He thought about Carol Briggs and the people above her who had authorized the investigation, whoever they were, whoever had made the operation visible enough that Dalton's network had needed to flush them out. Those people were still out there. And now, because of what the last 3 months had produced, Marcus had a much more detailed picture of what he was looking at. Not 14 officers in a small Texas town, a network, with roots in state government, with the capacity to monitor an undercover investigation in real time and redirect it, with contacts who could shut down a case with a phone call. He thought, someone above Briggs is still working. Someone made Dalton nervous enough to run this whole operation. Someone is still looking. The lights of the next town appeared on the horizon. Marcus kept driving. He had a folder of evidence that was supposed to be worthless. He had been the bait. He had been watched and tracked and used and then dismissed. But they had made one mistake. They had let him leave.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.